So before we jump into the assignment for Module 4, I want to talk a little bit about command line UI, or user interface. You'll hear a lot of that UI in computing today and software development. You also hear UX. UX stands for user experience. That includes the user interface, but also the way your program interacts with the user. So user interface is part of user experience, but not the entirety of it. So a command line UI, if we're getting real fancy, you might build something that looks like this. And this, by the way, is not as complicated as it might seem to do. And I don't have to I don't have to count how many spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's some tricks to doing this mathematically to make it pretty easy on yourself. But you can make your programs a lot more user-friendly, a lot more interesting to look at, a lot easier to use. You can see here I've got a nice header, I've got some basic instructions. It's pretty plain. It's easy to use because it's simple and direct. So the way Python sees the world is in a grid. And it builds this grid one row at a time. And in Python's world, that grid is 80 squares wide. Why 80? Because early computer monitors, back when Python was built, could display 80 characters across. Now, obviously, we have font sizes. There were no font sizes back then, by the way. Every character in every font was one character wide, whether it was a period or an L or a big W. See, when we started talking about fonts, what we realized is that different characters were different widths. But in command line and in what we call monospace type, which was all type before we had the invention of fonts by Steve Jobs sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, each character, no matter how wide it actually was, takes up one space. A space takes up a space, a period takes up a space, capitals, lowercase, each one is one. So you can write 80 characters wide of anything in the Python world. And now in a modern Python program, can you go wider than 80 characters? Yeah, but we still kind of hold to that convention. So we use that as sort of a benchmark for what we want to do. But we can use that grid to our advantage because that's what allows us to create these sort of interfaces that have not really a graphic look and feel, but kind of. Because we know that with characters from our keyboard, we can produce all kinds of things. We can produce things that our brain interprets as images, right? So when we are creating something in this grid, it really does come down to math and being able to produce a mathematical formula or an algorithm that creates those sort of interfaces. And so when I have a grid like this, my first line of code here, my first line of that interface is the number sign times 80, basically, right? Now I could create a string that is 80 number signs wide.